Hello, and welcome to our presentation, Writing Personal Stories. I am Randell Jones, publisher of the Personal Story Publishing Project and producer of the 6 Minute Stories podcast. You can find information about these two projects and all our books at randelljones.com. That is the same website as danielboonefootsteps.com, which may suggest to you that I have written a number of books on American history, and I have, all from my home here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Today, however, you want to know about writing personal stories, and we want to share information and encouragements with you in this video to help you do just that. This presentation about writing personal stories is based on workshops we have conducted with groups of writers interested in improving their own abilities to tell a personal story in writing. We'll be sharing with you some of what we have learned from the writers who have attended our workshops, both what they as writers say they like to see in a good personal story, and something about what these writers tell us they need to become better writers themselves. And most of this video is our sharing with you 7 essential elements of the personal story. In illustrating those elements, we'll be reading some strong examples of those essential elements taken from our latest collection of personal stories from the 2020 Personal Story Publishing Project, That Southern Thing, Living, Loving, Laughing, Loathing, Leaving the South. As the great Southern writer William Faulkner said, everyone in the South has no time for reading because they are all too busy writing. And we suspect that includes you too. So thank you for joining us for this recorded presentation. Let's get started. Here is what we are covering today, and in the order we'll get to them. You see that we have 2 short presentations we put in the appendix section at the end. On the screen you can see the approximate times into this video, where you can jump ahead to any segment if you want, or where you can go back to review any segment at a later time. And on this screen you can see the 7 essential elements of the personal story listed along with the story excerpts we are sharing as examples. You may find this screen helpful if you want to jump back to any story excerpts later. Our slogan for the 6 Minute Stories podcast is something you've probably heard before and might already strongly believe as we do: everybody loves a good story. Indeed, we humans are wired to welcome a story that sweeps us into a narrative of enchantment and entrancement. But what about the personal story? You can find all sorts of lists of types of writing that fall into this category of personal writing, such as memoir and essays and journals and creative nonfiction. And those of you who have English degrees and MFAs know a few more. But today, we want to look at writing personal stories not from their academic form, but rather from the perspective of why we write them. Here are our thoughts on that. You may find some of your own motivations mentioned in here as well. One reason, of course, is to document events, simply to record for posterity the who, what, when, where, why, hows of our lives. If you are writing a journal or a diary, you are doing that. Maybe. We say maybe because you may be doing the same thing, not to document everything, but to impress your audience by emphasizing some things over others. If you write an annual family holiday letter or get such annual family letters among your holiday mail, you know what a story written to impress sounds like. Or you might write a personal story to inspire others. That is a noble cause, of course, and if you can influence someone through your story into a course of action, you may be doing God's work, or you might be the devil incarnate. So intention matters, and so does truth-telling. Another important reason we write personal stories is not to tell others what is what, but rather to discover for ourselves what we do not know about ourselves. I am fond of the saying that we don't know what we are thinking until we articulate it. That is not original to me. Others have said as much in other ways, because it is true. It is human nature. So we write to discover our own thoughts and to unearth feelings and beliefs that we didn't know we had, those that may have been running our lives nonetheless because those beliefs and feelings were just below our consciousness, not part of our conscious selves. That hiddenness is what makes those beliefs and feelings so powerful, and in some cases, so dangerous. We find a related hint at this circumstance described in the Myers-Briggs personality types with regard to one of the four pairs of opposites. Each of us is somewhere on the continuum of introvert-extrovert as our individual preferences. I found it useful to realize that, in general, introverts think before they speak. Consequently, introverts can be seen by others as slow and reserved. Extroverts, on the other hand, may have to speak to find out what they are thinking. So extroverts might be quick with a comment, be it right or wrong, useful or not. The point is, we write personal stories to discover something about ourselves and something about ourselves in relationship to others. And sometimes that something may be hidden from us as well. And while we are writing so we can discover something about ourselves, we are also taking stock. We are taking a measure of ourselves and our situations. We are comparing two things, our status and our desires, what we've got and what we want. Now, we've all heard the old saw that there are two ways to be rich. One is to have a lot of money, and the other is to not have many needs. Well, there are two ways to be happy as well. One is to have what you want. The other, and you can mouth the words along with me on this, is to want what you have. So here is a simple model that will foster for you more explorative writing sessions than you'll wish you ever had time for. You will never again be at a loss for something to write about. It is three circles, overlapping as they might, and you get to decide if and how they do overlap. Each is labeled with a single word that opens your interior world, your internal dialogue, awaiting your examination. The words are is, want, should. What is, what you want, what you think should be. Now you can play that out on any personal matter and see which way the circles move for you, aligning perhaps or repelling from one another like magnets of the same pole. A quick example can help show what I'm describing here. Let's take dark chocolate and wine. Am I having dark chocolate and wine right now? Let's assume no, that I am not. Do I want to be having dark chocolate and wine? Absolutely yes. Should I be having dark chocolate and wine? Maybe. So you can see when is, want, should overlap, that is your happy place. What you are doing is what you want to do, and it is what you think you should be doing. Yay! But happy can be lost if one of three things changes. If you are not doing what you want to do and you think you should be doing. Lost again if you are doing what you want to be doing and yet you know you should not. Lost again if you are doing what you should be doing but you don't want to be doing it. I think you can see immediately the opportunities thinking about your life situations using this model affords the writer who is eager to explore and to discover themselves. As we said, you will never be at a loss for something personal to write about. And last, I think many of us write personal stories to make meaning of our life journey. What did we see? What did we do? What did we learn? How and why? So what? And the big one we all wrestle with in our accounting: who did I help and who did I harm? So that I don't leave you on that pensive note as we end this segment of our presentation today, let me mention another special kind of writing which has engaged me for years, and that is historical writing. During the last 15 years or so, I have written about 100 unpaid history-based guest columns offered up from time to time on the editorial pages of my hometown newspaper, the Winston-Salem Journal. The history stories I write are not personal stories in the sense that they are written in the first person singular of the writer. They are, and I want to emphasize this, written more often than not in first person plural. These are stories about us, all of us, our common experience. And exploring history offers the writer one extremely useful advantage that you and I, writing our first person singular personal stories, do not have. You and I look into the future and wonder what might happen if we do this or do that. We don't know. But when I am writing about history, our collective story, and I explore the circumstances and situation and a decision, I don't have to wonder what might happen. All I have to do is turn the page, and that uncertain future has become historic fact. We know what happened. We know the outcomes, the consequences, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it all. So for me, historical writing is a form of writing personal stories. So that is a quick overview of some of the motivations some of us may have for writing our personal stories. Perhaps you have some which have not been mentioned here. Yours are just as valid, and you can add yours to this list. Well, let's move on to what many of you want to learn from this presentation. We have just talked about why we write personal stories. Now let's talk about the how of writing personal stories. We'll do this by suggesting that we acknowledge 7 essential elements of writing personal stories. 7 essential elements of the personal story. A well-composed personal story pays attention to 7 key elements, we think. All of them are important aspects of good writing of any kind, but we'll explore each and look at how they are exemplified in some of the stories included in the 3rd anthology of the Personal Story Publishing Project, our 2020 collection titled That Southern Thing: Living, Loving, Laughing, Loathing, Leaving the South. Author's presence. Our first essential element is the author's presence. Writers put themselves into the story from the start. A personal story is a sharing in first person, so we are expecting and wanting that first person singular pronoun to show up pretty quickly. The readers then know who is speaking to them. Details provided by the writer help the readers feel intimately connected to the writer. The readers are bonding with the writer. The writer's voice is an expression of his or her own personality and experiences. That voice is revealed in how he or she tells a story. Our voice is not only our vivid descriptions of what we remember, but how we remember it and what we think now about those memories. That is one of the principles of writing a personal story, at least in the essay form. You tell a story and watch yourself telling it, having a sidebar conversation with the reader. We'll talk more about that in another essential element. But listen now to a good example of the author being present in a story opening. This author is writing of a memory from 6 decades before, a fact which the reader discovers later in the story. This is A Southern Girlhood, No Crinolines, by Annie McLeod Jenkins. I remember the air, dry and hot, heavy and still, full of the potential for sweat and discomfort. I remember the smell of the pine sap, the decaying underlayer of needles, the greenish smell of a nearby pond, and hardwoods. I remember the freedom. We were three skinny 10-year-old girls, Margaret, Kent, and Annie, still children in those days before 10-year-old girls were regularly wearing bras. We set out looking for adventure, dressed in our high-top canvas tennis shoes, not sneakers, our boys' white T-shirts, called undershirts in that day, and our blue jeans, not just jeans. Our goal was at least a mile, maybe 2 by road, and probably 3/4 of a mile by the proverbial crow's flight. Our starting point was Margaret's home in the country, 18 miles from my home in Winnsboro, and about a mile from the nearest neighbors. Dauntless, we were kitted out with World War II Army surplus sleeping bags, canteens, knapsacks, assorted knives, and items we thought necessary to survive a couple of days camping alone in a South Carolina July.
Now, this writer has earned our ears by giving us vivid details, the girls' names, what they were wearing, even using the vintage names for the clothing. We know the specifics of the distances they were walking and what they were carrying as camping supplies. And last, we are told the place and the time of year. Any of us can immediately imagine being right there with them, and we want to know more. Author's engagement with the world. The second essential is engagement with the world. A good personal story engages with real life. It is relevant to something of interest to the reader, so it has to be addressing some universal issue of the human condition, some experience with which most readers can connect in some way. The writer finds a situation that needs some resolution, some action to satisfy a problem. Tell the reader what you did and what happened as a result. But before you can take them through your story, you have to get their attention and earn their interest. A catchy title and a good opening line are your best tools, and telling your personal story from a quirky angle is a great strategy too. Here is a story excerpt that uses that strategy and those tools. This story addresses an issue that faces every one of us sooner or later, and we are going to have your attention as soon as we read the title, and here it is. Casket Shopping by Karen Luke Jackson. The thought of a casket closing over my face sends shivers down my spine, Mama said whenever the conversation turned to funerals. I can't breathe. It's like I'm being smothered. Mama's trepidation about being trapped in a coffin increased as she entered her 80s and as she began to diminish. Planning her funeral bloomed into an obsession. She eventually convinced Daddy, my younger sister Janice, and me that she'd get some peace of mind if she could pick out the casket in which she'd be buried. So the writer has captured our attention with the title and earned our interest with the opening line. And yes, this is a universal issue that affects us all, and one that nobody wants to talk about. Part of the energy for the story comes from it being about something we as readers can imagine us dealing with ourselves, yet something we prefer not to think about. And we can find humor in stories about those things we are avoiding. Avoidance is our coping mechanism, and laughing at our quirkiness is easier than facing the challenges. That's just human nature. We won't spoil the story for you, but the tale continues with a scene in the funeral home talking to the funeral director, with the writer making a reference to Clyde Edgerton's Walking Across Egypt. Self-exploration and self-discovery. A third essential element of the personal story is the matter of self-exploration and self-discovery. This element of personal stories works in our favor because people love to watch excavations. Any kind of digging always draws a crowd. People are intrigued by the uncovering of things hidden beneath layers. Archaeological digs and treasure hunts for sure, even Easter egg hunts. We'll look at two examples. What readers really like in a writer involved in self-exploration is one who honestly conveys they are inadequate in some way, who admit a flaw or a weakness, perhaps an ignorance of something. Perhaps the attraction to such a story is a matter of, well, I may not be the brightest bulb in the box, but at least I didn't do that. The writer helps the readers feel better about themselves, and indeed we admire a writer for being so vulnerable in telling truth. That situation, of course, can set up a comedy of errors, as happens in this story. You'll hear early on the writer telling you plainly what his flaws and vulnerabilities are. You know he is setting himself up for trouble. And although you may think from the title we are selecting stories on some morbid theme, this story is not really about what you might think from the title alone.
This is Why I Did Not Make It to the Funeral by Scott Hooper.
Funerals are big events in the South. Remembering the deceased while reuniting friends and long-lost relatives is a cultural tradition. It is part of Southern heritage, and as such it is an activity most certainly not to be missed. Unfortunately, I have some sort of mental block when I am told the details of an upcoming wake. I hear funeral, blah, 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 2 to 4, blah, blah, location. I make a mental note and file it away until I need to retrieve it. I admit I am also geographically challenged. When I am going somewhere for the first time, I always leave 20 minutes early for what I call getting lost time. In 40 years of driving, I have always needed that getting lost time because places are never where they are supposed to be and things never look like I pictured them in my head. And I often get left and right confused too. And so does this writer get lost on his way to the funeral? You bet. And do readers feel better about themselves after reading what he did? Again, you bet. Successful story, entertaining, and a cautionary tale, 2 for 2. Of course, self-discovery can be serious business, and writing for that outcome is, in fact, why many of us write. So let's look at that aspect of this essential element. Others have said as much differently, but we like the phrase, we don't know what we are thinking until we articulate it. In that way, writing is revelatory for us all. And self-revelation can cut across time and probably should. It can be about who we were, who we are, and who we are becoming or fear that we might become. And looking at ourselves in the past now and imagining the future is tough, uneasy work, but a writer of a good personal story is good at self-inquisition, exploring why they felt that way then and why they feel this way now. Here is another good example of a personal story based on self-exploration, one on a serious note.
This is Why Do Things Have to Be So Hard by Lubrina Burton.
The last place I thought I would find myself thinking about my home in southeastern Kentucky was at the night infiltration course in basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, on a hot, sticky July evening in 1997. I was wondering if I'd actually be able to crawl the 150 meters under prickly concertina wire with my unwieldy rucksack and M16, while the Army shot off live tracer rounds and flares over my head. I'd scarcely stop shaking even when the drill sergeant screamed at us to hit the dirt. Now, at this point in the story, the writer starts thinking back to her high school days and the realization that she can't stay at home because there are no jobs, and her mother has said, "You're on your own at 18." and that's why she joined the Army. Now, back to the writer's story. She concludes her reminiscences of leaving home in one paragraph and then takes the reader back to that opening scene where she has just crawled under the concertina wire with the live ammunition being shot overhead. On that night before I left for basic, I pulled my dogs in close and sobbed into their soft fur. Part of me still wanted one more summer to be a kid, play with my pups, and dream up at the sky. But it was time to grow up, leave home, and become a woman. Back in Missouri, the drill sergeants called for us to get into formation. The cannons were letting up, and it was time to head out. I stood up and inhaled the humid air mixed with the dry dirt. I had grown accustomed not only to the feeling, but I had started to enjoy the slight pain the odd mixture brought to my lungs. With each burning breath, I was closer to the life I wanted. I breathed the scorched air into my chest and exhaled my doubts. I looked over my shoulder to catch one last glimpse of the awesome tracers. Then I slung my rucksack onto my back, picked up my M16, and marched off, ready to face the next hard things to come. Again, we see and hear this writer doing an excellent job of self-exploration, sharing vignettes from two different times in her life and revealing not only her anxieties and fears, but sharing the transformation that led her in that experience to a recognition of a new quality of her character, courage. Underneath this story is an encouragement to the reader, we think, that you too can do the hard things. Take that one step at a time and keep moving forward. Show and tell. Another essential element of a good personal story is doing two things at once, telling the story and then simultaneously commenting on your telling of the story. It is like a Shakespearean soliloquy, where the writer, like the stage actor, steps away from the action on stage and shares an aside with the audience, in this case, the reader. In other words, sharing what happened is only part of the story. Making sense of what happened and telling about that sense-making is the key to the personal story. This is the element we mentioned earlier under author's presence and said we'd explore more. Here is a good example of that telling a story and commenting on the writer's journey through that story, the showing and telling. This writer is reflecting on the differences he has observed among people in the various places he's lived. This is Living in the South by Bill Donahue. I grew up in America's heartland, awash with a bag of stereotypes and bias against pretty much anyone who didn't sound like Walter Cronkite or behave like Mary Tyler Moore. Here the writer then goes on to mention Jell-O molds and casserole dishes and moving from Iowa to New York and then to North Carolina. And then later in the story he writes, "Not long ago I visited my daughter in Korea, where there were no casseroles, but also seemingly no homeless. Unlike Iowa or New York or North Carolina, there was also, and most curiously, no eye contact. Therein lies the key I've found. I hadn't known enough about Korea to build up any real appreciation or bias about eye contact. I was merely curious. At the same time, I observed another cultural phenomenon. Everyone held hands. On the streets, in the metro, everywhere. Classmates, friends, family of all ages and genders, affectionate but asexual. I'm sure I harbored deeply buried World War II biases, something about slanted eyes and kamikaze fighters. Even though my rational mind could differentiate Korea from Japan, there were probably some neurotransmissions I was unaware of. But I was curious about hand-holding and eye contact, and that was the key. Curiosity trumps judgment. A curious soul is an open, learning soul. So there in those paragraphs is self-discovery explained. It makes for an engaging personal story, entertaining for sure, but mostly thought-provoking. And of course, the writer can be obvious about this commentary or subtle, bold and in your face, or only mildly suggestive. Therein lies the art in the craft of writing. We like the description Anne Patchett gives for the difference between popular fiction and literary fiction as a rough parallel to our point here. She says that with popular fiction, the writer puts the reader in the back seat and drives them to the end of the story. They both arrive together at the end with the same understanding of what happened. With literary fiction, she says, each reader is having his or her own experience of the writer's story based on the reader's own knowledge and life experiences, which resonate and come to mind with the writer's story. Each reader has a different interpretation of the story, and she says possibly different each time the same reader reads that story. So the degree to which a writer shares details about their own telling of the story is like that. You can put the reader in the back seat and drive them to the end of the story, or you can provide some information along the way, some of your own reflections, which let each reader discover something of their own inside your story. Veracity and authenticity. Veracity and authenticity are the fifth essential elements of the personal story. Veracity is being accurately truthful, telling events exactly as they occurred to the best of your knowledge and the known record. Authenticity is more about the writer, we think, being vulnerable to the effects of telling the truth. If you are writing the facts to make yourself look good or avoid being blamed or being cast in a bad light, then you are not being authentic, and it will show. You can't hide that. Your writer's voice will be hollow and suspect. The best advice we've found regarding veracity is, quote, to be responsibly fair to the memory of events and faithful to the sense of the emotional elements in the story, end quote. That's two things, and the writer should be striving for both. Here is an example in which the writer's voice establishes her authenticity by sharing what we recognize as honest and truthful accounts from her life. We accept her veracity because she has made herself vulnerable to the reader's judgment. We believe what she is saying and that she is being faithful to the emotions of the story. We trust the writer's story. We trust her. This is Southern Lineage by Grace Ellis. My mother was groomed to be deeply Southern, not Dukes of Hazzard Southern, heaven forbid, but aristocratic, Charleston, Savannah Southern. Her father's grandfather was one of the secretaries of the Treasury for the Confederacy, and his mansion later became the site of Ashley Hall, a private school for Charleston's privileged young women. Her mother's grandfather was a distinguished Presbyterian minister, and her mother's first cousin married Woodrow Wilson. When I took a course in Asian theater, the professor commented that I had an unusually good understanding of the caste system. Of course I did. My mother's family considered themselves to be members of the professional class, doctors, lawyers, professors, ministers, and maybe bankers too. They looked down on working class people and also to an extent on entrepreneurs, whose wealth exceeded theirs, but who were considered to be crude. And of course, in that era, African Americans were seen as an altogether separate category. My mother's mother taught her there were two types of behavior, what was proper and what was common, a word that meant not frequently occurring,
but an indication of being a lower caste commoner. As she grew up, my mother rebelled against her upbringing. Although she was eligible to make her debut at the St. Cecilia Society Ball, she declined because she did not like associating with those snooty young women. In college, my mother was active in the YWCA and attended a conference where young black and white women ate meals at the same table. The story goes that after this occasion, FBI agents visited her father to apprise him of her misconduct. Although my grandfather undoubtedly disapproved of her behavior, he disapproved even more of the government poking its nose into his business. He sent them packing. We hear this writer's honesty from the start. She has established veracity and her telling sounds authentic. We trust that what she is telling us is absolutely her truth. We are intrigued to know more. You might hear people say that all stories are true, but they may not be factual. That is, they are true to human nature and to the people involved, even if how you told it is not 100%. Those who embrace that will agree with the old saw, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Although I think that one opens us writers up to a little more latitude than might be healthy. Each writer has to decide what they can live with. Remember, taking liberties can be taking advantage. Changeability of form. Part of the creativity in writing a personal story is telling it in an interesting way. After all, this is storytelling, not a 5-paragraph high school essay. Any story might be told in any number of ways: ballads, epic poems, short stories, novels, graphic novels, exposés, documentaries, stage plays, musicals, movies, animation. The list goes on. And any writer might be searching for the ideal form for telling a particular story. So one strategy is just to get all the facts down on the screen or on the paper and to keep telling the story over and over until the form of the story starts to emerge and eventually reveals itself to you, the writer. You will discover it. For the personal story publishing project, our form is pretty well set. 800 words of prose. Now, our editors write prose, and all the stories we've received have been prose. We have no experience with poetry, so we don't consider it for our anthologies. The only poetry we've had were song lyrics written by the writer, and the song was germane to the story being told. But this year, we had one story that was a special form of poetry, spoken word. And true to our topic right now about this essential element, form, the message the writer offered us was best delivered in spoken word. She had originally presented it as prose because she knew that was what we were looking for, but we were open to her reworking it to fit her writing style. That has worked out for our collection because it is a powerful personal story. And when you see it laid out on the pages in the book, you can imagine her reading this story titled All That I Could Say. It would be inauthentic for me to try reading her powerful spoken word piece, so I will not do that. It is a confrontation with racism. You should read it. You should hear her read it. But we will share its closing lines. These are the self-reflective ones after all the tension and anger and high energy of the piece has climaxed. This is the denouement. This is how she ends her personal story. All That I Could Say by Lauren Summers. As I walked away, my clothes clung to my clammy skin. The breath finally expelled from my lungs. I walked away that night feeling defeated, but not by him. The voice I had learned to find somehow abandoned me that night. I said all that I could say, yet I didn't say enough.
So we writers can be open to changing the form of our story if we think another form offers us options to explore for better revealing what we are trying to express. We should also mention another aspect to changing form in writing a personal story. A diversion from the main point should have a point to make. An example best explains this point. One of the writers did this masterfully in his story. He is writing about a family meeting with the matriarch of the family and all the adult children sitting around a table. Someone has said something startling. The writer's mother is about to speak. Just before the writer has her speak, the writer gives us a peek into his mother's character. This excerpt is from How Uncle Gene Got His Cut by Richard Groves. The family sat in stunned silence. Gene was there at the table. Finally, my mother, bless her heart, spoke. Now here's all you need to know about my mother. One day, decades later, when her pastor came to visit her in the nursing home, he found her in her wheelchair with her chin resting on her chest. "Mrs. Groves," he said, "are you asleep?" "No," she said, barely looking up. "I thought if I closed my eyes you would think I was and leave me alone. Obviously it didn't work." That was my mom. So you see, that diversion from the main point of the story had its own point to make, and that was skillfully accomplished by changing the form of the story, putting that aside in the story. And it gives us insight into the character of the mother, who then speaks, and the story turns on what she says. Intellectual payoff. The seventh, and not surprisingly the last essential element of the personal story, is the intellectual payoff derived from the story by the reader. The payoff is the discovery made by the reader during the journey on which the writer has taken the reader. This is the punchline, the reason the story was written. For our personal story projects, this payoff is the point of the story that resonates with the theme of our collection. It is the satisfying conclusion to the story the writer was telling. It doesn't have to be pleasing. I say satisfying in the way a mathematical manipulation satisfies an equation. The payoff just brings it to conclusion. It resolves the tension in the story. One technique for bringing a story to conclusion in a satisfying way is the callback, in which the conclusion refers back to something at the beginning, something that sort of hinted at what would happen throughout the story. Here is a good example of a well-done callback that helps punctuate a delightful story. We'll read the opening paragraph and then we'll jump to the last so you can hear that callback reference. This is Our Wildlife Sanctuary by Charles Davenport, Jr. We called my younger brother Snake Eyes, not because of some hideous birth defect, but because he was always the first to see serpents, which we encountered often. His was not the only nickname. Mine was Bubba, and our two best friends were Flea and Turtle. In the mid-70s, our neighborhood in Greensboro, North Carolina was surrounded by woods, lakes, and streams, what today would be called green space. Nearby was Jefferson Country Club, the centerpiece of a massive wildlife sanctuary. On that glorious expanse of field and forest we camped, played football, tossed frisbees, and even rode motorcycles. Technically, if you're a stickler for rules, you could say we were trespassing on private property, and we knew it. Now the story then recounts numerous episodes of the wildlife, including belly flopping in the swimming hole they created by damming up the creek, avoiding snakes, learning to cuss like sailors, and escaping the country club security guards who foolishly pursued them in golf carts, only to see the land later developed into a shopping center. At that point, the writer concludes in his closing paragraph. To some folks, development engenders a sense of progress. I disagree. The words describing such progress drift into my head as time-traveling fugitives from the artful, profane oratory we mastered while belly-flopping into our swimming hole deep in those forbidden woods where Bubba, Flea, Turtle, and Snake Eyes used to play. This writer does a great callback to the opening introduction of his memorably named characters. We call them characters because these young fellows are all grown up now and don't really exist except in memory. And recording and recapturing memories is one of the big reasons we write our personal stories. So for the seventh essential element of writing a personal story, the ending is the payoff for the story you've written and that the reader has spent time working through. Make your ending rewarding for both of you. So there you have it, the 7 essential elements of the personal story. We have shared some thoughts on these principles with you and shared some examples with you of the good writing you'll find in that Southern thing, living, loving, laughing, loathing, leaving the South. You may want to watch this presentation again and take some notes on ideas that strike you and interest you to explore in your own writing. Of course, a good personal story has many dimensions to it, and we have shared just 7 which we thought would be useful to those wanting to improve and polish their writing. This is not an exhaustive list. You may have some ideas of your own to add to this mix. Please do, and above all, keep writing. And keep reading. You'll find many other good examples of each of these 7 essential elements among the 45 personal stories in this current collection, That Southern Thing, and also among the stories in the other collections we have published for the Personal Story Publishing Project. From this presentation and from all our collections, we hope you find ideas and encouragements for your own writing of personal stories. It is, after all, your personal stories we are eager to read. So now comes your opportunity to participate in an upcoming personal story publishing project. You'll find the details in the next section of this presentation. We've called it Accepting the Challenge. And please remember that in the appendix you'll learn more about what other writers tell us they like in a good personal story and what they say they want to improve their own writing. So please keep watching this presentation. We have lots more good information to share with you. Now comes your opportunity to put all this information to good use, and we have an invitation for you. Maybe you have discovered that you are already doing in your writing many or all of the things which make for good personal stories. Or maybe you are interested in trying out some of the ideas shared here in your own writing. In either case, we invite you to consider participating in the Personal Story Publishing Project. Each project invites personal stories resonating with a general theme. In 2018, the theme was Making Do, Bearing Up, and Overcoming Adversity. In 2019, we invited stories about exploring, discoveries, challenges, adventure. Our 2020 collection, from which we drew stories for the excerpts shared in this video, has the theme That Southern Thing, Living, Loving, Laughing, Loathing, Leaving the South. So far, we have announced each new theme in August and issued our call for personal stories through mid-December. Stories are selected during January. Editing, layout, and proofing follow in collaboration with each writer. The new collection is released in early April. The personal stories are encouraged to be 750 to 800 words. Each collection includes 45 stories in a 200-page book. Writers are not required to purchase any copies of the book, but copies are available at a discounted price to writers with the initial printing. Some writers purchase copies to sell, others share copies with friends and family. Our goal, quite simply, is to encourage good writing by making this publishing opportunity available. All writers retain full rights to their separate stories, which they can publish elsewhere at any time. Writers simply give us permission to publish the story in the collection and our 6-Minute Stories podcast, through which selected stories receive broader exposure. Submissions to the Personal Story Publishing Project are accepted online during the call for personal stories with a nominal reading fee, which is even less for early submissions. We've done everything we can think of to make this opportunity attractive to writers interested in sharing a story with others in one of our collections. Now it is your turn. All the information you need for participating in the Personal Story Publishing Project can be found online at randelljones.com. That's RANDELL Jones.com. Or if it is easier to remember, DanielBooneFootsteps.com will get you to the same website. We are also Daniel Boone Footsteps Publishing. We look forward to hearing from you when we next issue a call for personal stories for the Personal Story Publishing Project. And remember, everybody loves a good story. Thank you for watching this video. Now let me tell you a little bit about the producer. Randell Jones is an award-winning history writer and storyteller. He has written and edited 9 nonfiction history books. Since 2007, he has served as an invited member of the Rhodes Scholar Speakers Bureau of the North Carolina Humanities Council. That means they financially support nonprofit organizations all across the state who invite him and other Rhodes Scholar speakers to present a program on the humanities. Randell speaks on particular historical topics about which he has written books, including the life of America's pioneer hero Daniel Boone, the Battle of Kings Mountain during the American Revolution, and the ever-popular Famous and Infamous Women of North Carolina. Randell has received 2 Kentucky History Awards from the Kentucky Historical Society, numerous book awards from the North Carolina Society of Historians, and in 2013, the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution conferred on him its prestigious National History Award Medal for his body of work during the prior 10 years. For over 25 years, Randell has written history-based guest columns for the Winston-Salem Journal, bringing aspects of North Carolina and American history to bear on current events. Many of those columns are collected in his book From Time to Time in North Carolina. It was from that collection which arose the idea in 2017 for the Personal Story Publishing Project. That project and its annual collections have become a valued platform for sharing the writing of new voices and experienced writers. And from that platform, we launched in 2019 our 6-Minute Stories podcast to extend the exposure of these personal stories to a broader public eager to hear and to read good writing. So that's our story. We want to hear yours. Please consider participating in the next call for personal stories to offer your good writing to the Personal Story Publishing Project. And remember, everybody loves a good story. Thank you again for watching this video, Writing Personal Stories. We're glad to have you spend your time to see what we might have to say that would be of value to you. We have an appendix to this video, and if you continue listening, you will hear 2 other presentations of information from which you may glean some useful insights. The first is what writers look for in good personal stories. This is feedback to us during our workshops from writers themselves on what they think they like in good personal stories. And the second is what writers say they want to help them improve. You may find some of the things that you're looking for to improve your writing listed along with what these writers have told us they would like. We hope you find this additional information useful. Thank you again for watching Writing Personal Stories. What writers tell us they look for in a good personal story. In our workshops, we have the participants prepare beforehand by reading a short personal story, usually a national columnist will do, and then we have them identify and share as a group the elements of that story that they liked. These are elements of good writing that these writers can recognize in personal stories that they enjoy and appreciate. Now, this exercise is a good springboard into thinking about what they might want to do to improve their own personal writing. You can do this yourself by thinking about what you like and the writing you enjoy and think is especially good. Or you can compare notes with another reader or two. Getting these other perspectives is really helpful because we all know what we can see. We need to learn how to see these elements of good writing, which we might not be able to see unless someone else points it out. This is helpful in our improving because if we are always writing the way we like to write and we still aren't getting any new readers, well, therein may be our first clue. What is it in our writing that we cannot see that needs to be changed? Others can help us discover that. Then we can learn about how to discover the preferences of our readers, and that's the real goal here. So here is feedback from some of our participants on what they said they read and liked in personal stories. A good personal story is about more than one thing. One person said you might be writing about your garden, the flowers, the fertilizers, the watering, but the reader knows you are really writing about your children. A good personal story declares a universal truth and then gives interesting real-life examples to prove the point. A good personal story reveals the writer's humility. Now, sometimes that is accomplished through self-deprecating humor. Likewise, a good personal story connects emotionally with the reader and reveals the writer's humanity. The reader sees the writer describing their own feelings and emotions. The reader and the writer become human together. In a well-written personal story, the readers can imagine themselves being there and being involved in the situation. Similarly, the story includes enough detail to make it credible that it really happened just like that. Of course, they told us a good personal story has a story arc, a situation, a conflict, a resolution. A good personal story has a payoff, a punchline, a message, a lesson learned. And a good personal story ties the ending back to the setup. We seem to like the circular connections of the ending back to the beginning. At the end of the story, we are reading about something which happened at the outset. Now, these are just some of the insights writers have shared about what they like to see in well-written personal stories, and you will recognize these are some of the 7 essential elements of the personal story. That just means that we as writers already know a lot about our craft. We know what we are doing, and we know there are no hard and fast rules, mostly just preferences. Our task as writers is to understand those preferences and then set about looking at our own writing to see what we are already doing well and what we might want to do more of and what we might want to start doing to make our personal stories the best stories that we can write. What writers want so they can write better personal stories. So we've talked about why we write, how we write, and what we like in well-written personal stories. And if that were enough, then we'd all know the answers and we'd be merrily on our way and knocking out prize-winning stories by the hour. But as you know, and as we know through our workshops, it's just not that simple. There are obstacles in our way as writers. Now, we get input from our workshop participants on what obstacles they are facing that prevent them from writing and what they need more of. We suspect you may find some of these challenges on your own list. And our list is not exhaustive, of course. You may have some demons and barriers of your own. We share these here just so you know that you are not alone. Other writers are dealing with these as well, and here is what they told us in 4 broad categories. Discipline to write. Writing regularly and more often was mentioned by many people. They want a quiet place and time to reflect. This seems to be a universal need among writers. But also under this category, they want the discipline to stick with it, to not give up at each and every discouragement that they encounter. Now, a second category, of course, was just writing skills. They indicated they want the skill of writing dialogue that seems real to life and appropriate for the people involved. They want to be able to write details that make the story come alive. They want to know how to structure a story so that it flows and keeps the reader interested. They want to know how to write first and edit later, getting all the story down on the page and not edit as they go along. And then they wanted to know about editing for the reader, to have the courage to cut, knowing that less is more. And perhaps embracing Stephen King's notion that you just have to kill your little darlings, as he said in his book on writing. You got to kill those phrases that you've embraced so that you now find yourself writing around them and giving them special stature in your piece. And when you see that, when you see yourself doing that, it's a red flag to double check on why you are doing that. And probably that phrase that you've become enamored with is something you need to let go. A third category is courage. Writers want the courage to do 2 things. One, to tell the truth, usually about the writer's own self-revelation. This requires vulnerability and humility and honesty. And the second thing for which writers need courage is the courage to accept critical feedback without resistance. We writers, of course, are always tempted to explain away critical feedback, sometimes telling the reviewer, well, here's what you're not seeing. Well, that's just human nature. But we as writers have to remember, of course, that we will not be there with the reader to explain away their reactions. We have one shot at it, and it's in the words that we choose to put on the page, in the order and with the emphasis and the punctuations that we choose. And that's why accepting critical feedback without resistance is an essential skill to develop. Grin and bear it. Just say thank you. And better yet, ask for more. Ask for details. You could probe, what do you see or not see that made you think that? You see, feedback is the breakfast of champions, so show up hungry and ask for more. And the fourth category is confidence. Confidence in your writing. And we all know that confidence is like wisdom. As the old saw goes, wisdom comes from good judgment, and good judgment comes from experience. And experience, well, that comes from bad judgment. So likewise, confidence in your writing comes from putting your writing out there and seeing what happens to it, and always learning from that experience. Writers tell us they want feedback from a trusted friend. And that's because the one thing we writers all know in the depth of our bones to be absolutely true is that writing is a solitary experience until you find a reader. And that is both the joy and the curse.